The most devastating genetic tragedy of the Ozark Mountains was the twins born of grandfather and granddaughter. Text on black screen, a secret the mountains tried to bury. In the remote valleys of Missouri's Ozark Mountains, where ancient trees cling to mist and secrets are bred by isolation, a genetic tragedy would unfold, shocking local communities and medical professionals alike. Text on black screen was about to be born. This is the story of the Leadbetter family, a story where generations of intermarriage and isolation culminated in a 1952 case. Experts would later describe this case as one of the most severe instances of genetic collapse ever documented in American medical history. Text on black screen, their blood was too close. Nestled in Blackberry Hollow sat the Leadbetter homestead, a remote valley accessible only by a winding dirt road that became impassable during spring floods and the winter months. The family had settled there in 1887 when Jeremiah Leadbetter, fleeing debt collectors from Tennessee, found this hidden pocket of land, perfect for disappearing and unclaimed. Temporary seclusion was what began it, but it gradually transformed into permanent isolation. Text on black screen, the hollows swallowed them whole. The hollows could swallow families whole, explains regional historian Dr. Margaret Wilkins, as the family withdrew further from outside society with each new generation. The Ozarks have always harbored communities that existed almost entirely separate from mainstream America, especially before telephones and roads reached the deeper regions. Some valleys went decades without any outside visitors. By 1930, the Leadbetter property had become a compound of 4 crude cabins, an extended family of 17 individuals housed within. Through subsistence farming, hunting, and occasional trade with other isolated families in neighboring hollows, they survived. Text on black screen, a family turning in on itself. Their extreme suspicion of outsiders and a reluctance to marry beyond their immediate community is what made the Leadbetters particularly notable. Following his father's death in 1928, Thomas Leadbetter, born in 1895, became the family patriarch. According to county records, Thomas had married his first cousin, Martha, in 1913, producing 5 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. Among these was Eleanor, born in 1916, described in a rare school record as bright but withdrawn. Text on black screen, the lines were already blurring. A tragic turn came for Eleanor's life in 1932 when at age 16, she was married to Willis Cott, a man from a neighboring hollow 20 years her senior. County records indicate a daughter, Judith, was born to Eleanor in 1934. 3 months later, Willis Cott died in what was recorded as a hunting incident, though local rumors suggested otherwise. With no support system, Eleanor returned to her father's compound with her infant daughter. The intervening years remain largely undocumented, as the family had minimal contact with nearby towns or authorities. Text on black screen, then, a point of no return. A strange, closed household where outsiders were met with silence and shotguns was described in occasional reports from rare visitors, primarily traveling peddlers and once a lost Forest Service worker. Conditions where normal societal boundaries eroded were created by the profound isolation of the Leadbetter family. Text on black screen, a new, unthinkable relationship. The already problematic genetic closeness of the family would become catastrophically compounded as Judith grew into adolescence. Isolated communities sometimes develop their own moral codes that diverge significantly from mainstream society, explains medical anthropologist Dr. Howard Bennett. Combined with generations of intermarriage, the genetic risks multiply exponentially. Text on black screen, the stage was set for tragedy. By 1949, according to later court testimonies, Thomas Leadbetter had developed an inappropriate relationship with his granddaughter, Judith, then 15. By this point, Eleanor was described in witness accounts as showing signs of mental distress and excessive reliance on homebrew spirits. She either could not or would not intervene. Text on black screen, a storm would force the truth out. County records resurfaced in 1952 when a severe winter storm forced Eleanor to seek medical help in the nearby town of Thornfield. She arrived with her 17-year-old daughter, Judith, who was in labor and experiencing serious complications. The attending physician, Dr. William Harrison, would later document his shock upon learning through examination and questioning that the father of Judith's twins was her own grandfather, Thomas Lee Better, then 57 years old. Text on black screen, the doctor's blood ran cold. An ethical and medical crisis unlike anything they'd encountered faced the hospital staff, recounts medical historian Patricia Coleman. Not only was this a case of forbidden relations, but the genetic implications were immediately apparent when the twins were delivered. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel to understand the full depth of America's hidden genetic tragedies. These forgotten histories reveal the devastating consequences that shaped entire communities and bloodlines, knowledge that helps us understand our complex past. Text on black screen, the babies were here. The morning of February 12, 1952, began as another bitter winter day in the Ozarks. For 3 days, snow had fallen continuously, creating drifts that isolated even the most accessible communities. For the Lee Better family in Blackberry Hollow, this isolation was nearly complete until labor complications forced a desperate journey for 17-year-old Judith. Text on black screen, what the doctor saw horrified him. Eleanor Lee Better appeared at our door nearly frozen, recalled Nurse Ruth Simmons in a 1973 interview for the Thornfield Historical Society. She had somehow managed to pull her daughter on a makeshift sled for over 7 miles through snowdrifts. Both were suffering from exposure, and the pregnant girl was already experiencing seizures. Text on black screen, the truth could no longer be hidden. The only physician at Thornfield Small Medical Clinic, Dr. William Harrison, immediately recognized the severity of the situation. Symptoms of eclampsia, a dangerous pregnancy complication characterized by seizures and high blood pressure, were displayed by Judith. But as he began treatment, troubling physical characteristics in both mother and grandmother that suggested a history of genetic relatedness were noticed by Harrison. Text on black screen, the father is her grandfather. Unusual physical features that medical professionals are trained to recognize were shared by Eleanor and Judith, explained Dr. Harrison in his medical notes preserved in the county historical archives. Both displayed the characteristic facial asymmetry, low-set ears, and shortened fingers that often indicate consanguineous parentage. When questioned about the father of Judith's babies, Eleanor initially claimed a traveling salesman had taken advantage of her daughter. However, as Judith's condition worsened, Eleanor finally revealed the truth. The pregnancy was the result of relations between Judith and her own grandfather, Thomas Lee Better. Text on black screen, the delivery was a nightmare. Traumatic and complicated was the delivery that followed. After 14 hours of labor, Judith gave birth to twin boys. The infant's condition immediately alarmed the medical staff. Dr. Harrison's notes describe twinner presents with severe cranial malformation, apparent cleft palate, and fusion of digits on both hands. Twin B displays microcephaly, bilateral ocular defects, and shows no response to stimuli. Both infants exhibit cyanosis and respiratory distress. Text on black screen, the consequences were catastrophic. Quickly through the small community of Thornfield, population 382, news of the births traveled. By early evening, the local sheriff, James Woodson, arrived at the clinic. His official report filed February 14, 1952, states, informed by Dr. Harrison of suspected inappropriate relations within the Lee Better family resulting in the birth of severely affected twin infants. Have initiated investigation and contacted county prosecutor regarding potential charges. Text on black screen, one twin would not survive. The situation grew more complex when twin B, later named Joseph, died 36 hours after birth. The cause was listed as congenital heart defects incompatible with life. The surviving twin, William, required specialized care beyond what the small Thornfield clinic could provide. An emergency transfer to Springfield Baptist Hospital, 70 miles away, was arranged by Dr. Harrison. Text on black screen, the sheriff was going in. One of the most severe cases of genetic abnormalities I've encountered is represented by the surviving infant, wrote Dr. Edward Crowley, the pediatric specialist at Springfield. The constellation of defects suggests multiple recessive gene expressions consistent with the reported close familial relationship of the parents. While William fought for his life in Springfield, authorities moved to investigate the Leadbetter homestead. Sheriff Woodson, accompanied by 2 deputies, made the difficult journey to Blackberry Hollow on February 18 once roads became marginally passable. A disturbing picture of extreme isolation and cultural divergence was what they discovered. Text on black screen, they had created their own world. The compound consisted of 4 crude cabins connected by covered walkways, housing 12 individuals from 3 generations of Leadbetters. Initially, Thomas Leadbetter threatened the officers with a shotgun, but he ultimately surrendered when informed of the situation with his granddaughter and great-grandsons. Text on black screen, they saw no wrong in their actions. The family had essentially created their own society, Sheriff Woodson reported. They possessed almost no modern conveniences, used a bartering system among themselves, and had developed their own dialect that was at times difficult to understand. Most disturbing was their apparent lack of comprehension regarding why authorities were concerned about their family arrangements. Brought in to assess the situation was county anthropologist Dr. Helen Morris. An extreme example of cultural isolation is represented by the Leadbetter compound. Over 3 generations, they had developed practices and norms entirely divorced from mainstream society, including altered conceptions of appropriate familial relationships. This wasn't simply a case of individuals choosing to break societal taboos, but rather a community that had evolved in complete isolation to the point where such taboos no longer registered. Text on black screen, the surviving twin faced a painful life. Back in Springfield, baby William continued to struggle. Medical records indicate he suffered from hydrocephalus, fluid on the brain, severe skeletal malformations, and cognitive impairment. Emergency surgery to place a shunt to drain excess fluid from his brain was performed by doctors, likely the first such procedure seen in this remote region of the Ozarks. Text on black screen, a genetic collapse. A tragic convergence of multiple recessive genetic disorders is represented by the infant's conditions, noted Dr. Crowley. The close biological relationship between the parents allowed for the expression of harmful recessive genes that would typically remain dormant when genetic diversity exists. In this case, we're seeing the catastrophic results of generations of genetic isolation culminating in the closest possible relation. As February turned to March, 3 separate but interconnected dramas unfolded. Judith remained hospitalized, slowly recovering from her physical trauma but experiencing significant psychological distress. Baby William fought for his life in Springfield, and Thomas Leadbetter awaited his fate in the county jail as prosecutors determined what charges could be brought against him. Text on black screen, the town was about to split in 2. Attention beyond the immediate area had begun to attract the case. On March 3, a reporter from the Springfield newsletter arrived in Thornfield, resulting in the first public article about the situation. The headline read simply, "Ozark Isolation Leads to Family Tragedy." By April 1952, as dogwood trees bloomed across the Ozark hillsides, the case of the Leadbetter family had transformed from a local medical emergency to a divisive moral and legal dilemma that split the communities of Shannon County. The surviving twin, William, had been transferred to state care, while his mother, Judith, remained under medical supervision, diagnosed with what doctors then called nervous exhaustion. In the county jail, Thomas Leadbetter sat awaiting trial, charged with immoral relations with a dependent minor. Text on black screen, the victim refused to testify. Significant challenges were faced by the legal system in addressing the complex circumstances. County Prosecutor Harold Jenkins faced significant challenges in building his case. Unprecedented difficulties are presented by the situation, Jenkins wrote in his case notes preserved in county archives. The victim is unwilling to testify against her grandfather, appears unclear on appropriate familial boundaries, and expresses desire to return to the family compound. Medical experts confirm her developmental limitations, raising questions about competency to testify. Text on black screen, then, a shocking intervention. Along distinct lines, the community's response fractured. In Thornfield and larger Shannon County towns, outrage dominated public sentiment. Prayer meetings for the poor, deformed infant and his troubled mother were held by church congregations. Calls for the harshest possible punishment for Thomas Leadbetter were made in letters to the editor in the Shannon County Gazette. However, in the more isolated hollows and remote communities, reactions were more nuanced. Concern that government men were interfering in private family matters was expressed by some families who had lived in similar isolation. Others worried they too might face scrutiny for marriages between second or third cousins, common practices in areas where potential spouses were limited. Essentially a collision between two distinct cultural worlds existing within the same geographic region is what we witnessed, explains cultural historian Dr. Patricia Wilson. The more connected towns, influenced by broader American values, reacted with expected moral outrage. The isolated communities, operating under different norms developed through generations of separation, saw the intervention as threatening. The attention of Dr. Victor McCusick, a pioneering genetic researcher from Johns Hopkins University, was attracted by the case, who traveled to Missouri to study the Leadbetter family's genetic history. His findings would later form part of his groundbreaking work on inherited disorders. Text on black screen, a plea deal was the only way. A textbook example of genetic collapse is represented by the Leadbetter case, McCusick wrote. For generations of marriage between closely related individuals created a dangerous concentration of recessive genes. Multiple indicators of genetic distress were revealed by McCusick's examination of the extended Leadbetter family: unusually high rates of stillbirths, infant mortality, congenital defects, and intellectual disabilities. His research would later influence emerging genetic counseling practices across America. By May, the case had reached the desk of Missouri Governor Forrest Smith, who received petitions from Shannon County residents demanding the family compound be disbanded in the interest of public morality and the welfare of the remaining children. Meanwhile, signs of recovery began to be shown by Judith Leadbetter. Her progress was documented by her attending physician, Dr. Margaret Collins. Patient now communicates more freely and demonstrates improved effect. However, she remains confused about her relationship with her grandfather and the resulting pregnancy. She expresses attachment to her infant son, but limited understanding of his medical conditions. If you're watching this story unfold and feeling the weight of this American tragedy, leave a comment saying, "Some bloodlines should never cross." Your words acknowledge the devastating reality these isolated communities faced when genetic boundaries were erased. Text on black screen, a visitor would change everything. On May 18, 1952, as Thomas Leadbetter's trial date approached, a surprising development occurred. A delegation of women from neighboring hollows arrived at the hospital where Judith was recovering, led by Martha Hawkins, whose family had lived in nearby Sweetwater Hollow for 5 generations. They requested permission to visit with Judith. Hospital administrators initially refused, but Dr. Collins recognized a potential breakthrough. Text on black screen, they spoke a truth she understood. These women understand Judith's background in ways we cannot, she wrote. Their insight may prove valuable to her recovery. The meeting lasted 3 hours. No medical staff were permitted to attend at the women's insistence. But a statement was later provided by Martha Hawkins. "We talked with Judith woman to woman about things outsiders wouldn't understand. Life in the hollows is different. Sometimes terrible things happen when families get too turned in on themselves. We've seen it before. We told her there's no shame in what happened to her, but there's no going back either." Text on black screen, Judith's stunning decision. Following this meeting, a decision that shocked her medical team was made by Judith. She requested to speak with Prosecutor Jenkins and offered to testify against her grandfather. According to Jenkins' notes of the interview, Judith stated, "Martha helped me see clear. What happened wasn't right, even if I didn't know it then. The babies show it wasn't right." Text on black screen, the patriarch would face justice. Fundamentally altered by this testimony was the case against Thomas Lee Better. What had been a challenging prosecution with an unwilling victim suddenly became considerably stronger. A plea arrangement was approached by Thomas Lee Better's court-appointed attorney, James Mitchell, about with the prosecutor. On June 2, 1952, Thomas Lee Better pleaded guilty to reduced charges. Judge Wilson Harrington sentenced him to 7 years at Missouri State Penitentiary, the maximum allowed under the charges. In delivering the sentence, Harrington stated, "While this court acknowledges the unusual circumstances of isolation that may have contributed to distorted moral understanding, the protection of vulnerable individuals and the natural order of family relations must be upheld." Text on black screen, the hollow was silenced forever. The future of the Lee Better compound and its residents concerned the remaining question. An intervention was organized by county authorities with state support. The 7 minor children still living at the compound were placed in foster care. Assistance relocating to more connected communities and vocational training opportunities were offered to the adults. Judith's mother, Eleanor Lee Better, initially resisted these efforts but ultimately accepted placement in a state-supported residential facility in Jefferson City, where records indicate she was diagnosed with constitutional psychopathic inferiority, a term then used to describe various personality disorders. As summer arrived, bringing humid heat to the Ozarks, the once populated Lee Better Hollow fell silent. County records indicate the property was eventually sold for back taxes in 1956. Forest gradually reclaimed the clearings, and the cabins deteriorated into the landscape. For Judith and her surviving son, William, the future remained uncertain but hopeful. Both unexpected challenges and remarkable resilience would be revealed in the final chapter of their story. Text on black screen, but William's suffering was not over. As autumn painted the Ozark Mountains with brilliant reds and golds in 1952, from newspaper headlines to medical textbooks transitioned the Lee Better case. The surviving twin, William, now 7 months old, had become a subject of intense medical interest, representing one of the most comprehensively documented cases of genetic disorders resulting from consanguinity in American medical history. Text on black screen, he became a medical textbook case. Funding from the newly established National Institutes of Health was secured by Dr. Victor McCusick, who had examined the Lee Better family earlier that year, to conduct a longitudinal study of William's development. An extensive list of congenital conditions was documented by his research team: microcephaly, abnormally small head circumference, polydactyly, extra digits, bilateral ptosis, drooping eyelids, severe intellectual disability, seizure disorder, congenital heart defects, and skeletal malformations. Text on black screen, Judith began to heal. A convergence of recessive genetic disorders rarely seen in clinical settings is presented by William Lee Better's medical profile, McCusick wrote in his 1953 preliminary paper for the Journal of Medical Genetics. Compelling evidence of the catastrophic effects of extreme inbreeding, particularly when compounded over multiple generations, is provided by the case. While William received specialized care at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, a remarkable journey of personal transformation was begun by his mother, Judith. Court records indicate she was placed under the guardianship of the state and enrolled in a residential education program for young women with limited educational backgrounds. Contact through letters preserved in the Shannon County Historical Society archives was maintained by Martha Hawkins, the woman from Sweetwater Hollow who had helped Judith understand her situation. Judith's progress was chronicled in these letters. Dear Martha, the teachers here are helping me learn to read better. I can write my full name now and read simple books. They say I'm making good progress. I think about William every day. The doctors send pictures. He doesn't look like other babies, but they say he's getting stronger. Sometimes I cry thinking about everything. But Mrs. Patterson, her counselor, says that's normal and healthy. Judith Lee Better, September 1952. Text on black screen, William never knew a normal life. By early 1953, the attention of the emerging field of genetic counseling had been captured by the Lee Better case. As a teaching example in his lectures at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Sheldon Reed, who had coined the term genetic counseling just a few years earlier, used the case. How it demonstrates the cumulative effect of consanguineous relationships is what makes the Lee Better situation so valuable from an educational perspective, Reed explained in a 1954 medical conference presentation. Significant risk is carried by a single instance of close biological relatives producing offspring. But when this occurs in a family already compromised by generations of cousin marriages, the genetic consequences multiply exponentially. With little celebration past William's first birthday in February 1953. Medical records indicate he had the developmental capabilities of a 3-month-old infant, could not sit unassisted, and showed minimal response to stimuli. His care had been transferred to a state residential facility for children with severe disabilities in St. Louis, where his condition for research purposes was continued to be documented by the medical staff. Text on black screen, the case changed the Ozarks forever. Meanwhile, through both medical and social spheres in Shannon County and surrounding Ozark communities, the broader impact of the case continued to ripple. Informal genetic counseling to families known to have practiced cousin marriages was begun to be offered by local doctors. Educational materials about the risks of intermarriage were distributed by county extension services to remote communities. A community outreach program targeting isolated hollows was organized by Reverend John Pearson of First Baptist Church in Thornfield. The delicate approach required is reflected in his church newsletters from this period. We must reach our brothers and sisters in the remote regions, not with judgment but with compassion and practical assistance. Many families have lived for generations with limited contact beyond their immediate community, developing practices that may harm future generations unintentionally. By the summer of 1953, Judith Lee Better had progressed sufficiently in her educational program to be granted supervised visitation with her son. These visits are documented in staff notes from William's facility. Mother interacted appropriately with child considering his limitations. Displayed natural maternal behaviors, including gentle touch, speaking softly, and appropriate emotional attachment. Expressed sadness at his condition, but no visible signs of rejection. Thomas Lee Better, serving his sentence at Missouri State Penitentiary, maintained his innocence regarding any wrongdoing despite his guilty plea. As genuinely confused about societal boundaries regarding family relationships was described by prison psychological evaluations, and it was noted he expressed no remorse beyond feeling sad the babies weren't right. A paper in the Journal of Rural Sociology examining the social factors that contributed to the Lee Better situation was published by Dr. Margaret Collins, who continued to monitor Judith's progress. She wrote, conditions where deviant behaviors could normalize across generations were created by the extreme geographic and cultural isolation experienced by certain Ozark communities. In environments where outside social influences were absent for decades, what mainstream society views as fundamental taboos became blurred. In October 1953, renewed attention was received by the case when Life magazine published a feature article titled "Hidden America: Isolated Communities and Their Forgotten Challenges." While the Ledbetters weren't mentioned by name by the article, it referenced a recent case in the Missouri Ozarks and included interviews with doctors and social workers about the consequences of extreme isolation. This national exposure prompted Missouri Governor Phil M. Donnelly to establish a commission investigating isolated rural communities throughout the state. Their 1954 report identified 27 settlements classified as critically isolated, with residents having minimal contact with outside society, limited understanding of laws and norms, and concerning patterns of intermarriage. Text on black screen, Judith built a new life. As 1954 progressed, an unexpected turn was taken by Judith Ledbetter's story. Having completed her basic education program, she was offered employment as a kitchen assistant at the very facility where she had received treatment. Remarkable resilience and adaptability has been demonstrated by Judith, noted her counselor. While she continues to require some supervision and support, her progress suggests potential for semi-independent living with appropriate community supports. For William, however, the prognosis remained unchanged. Minimal developmental progress, chronic health challenges, and a growing list of complications were documented by quarterly medical evaluations. By his second birthday, 3 additional surgeries to address hydrocephalus and orthopedic issues had been undergone by him. William's condition was continued to be monitored by Dr. McCusick's research team, and their findings contributed significantly to the emerging understanding of genetic inheritance patterns. McCusick's groundbreaking 1966 publication, Mendelian Inheritance in Man, which became a foundational text in medical genetics, would eventually be referenced in by the Ledbetter case. As insights were gained by the scientific community from William's condition, the social aftermath of the Ledbetter case continued to transform life in the Ozarks. A gradual but significant decrease in the number of marriage licenses issued to couples sharing surnames or known family connections is indicated by county records. More profound was the decline in extremely isolated homesteads. Road improvements, rural electrification projects, and mobile health clinics specifically targeting remote hollows were facilitated by the commission established by Governor Donnelly. Previously isolated communities were gradually connected to mainstream society by these initiatives. While devastating for those directly involved, the Ledbetter tragedy ultimately catalyzed positive changes for similar communities throughout the Ozarks, observed sociologist Dr. James Williams in a 1957 follow-up study. Infrastructure improvements, educational outreach, and increased medical access have significantly reduced the conditions that allowed such extreme isolation to persist into the mid-20th century. Text on black screen, the hollow was reclaimed by nature. Gentle rains were brought to the Ozarks in the spring of 1959, transforming Blackberry Hollow into a lush green landscape that betrayed no hint of the tragedy that had unfolded there 7 years earlier. Long since reclaimed by nature had been the Ledbetter homestead. Only stone foundations and a collapsed chimney marked where generations had lived in isolation. For Judith Ledbetter, now 24 years old, an unexpected path towards stability had been taken by life. Records from the Shannon County Social Services Department indicate she had been released from state guardianship in 1957, having demonstrated sufficient improvement in cognitive functioning and social adaptation. Employment as a laundry worker at Baxter Memorial Hospital in Mountain Home, Arkansas, had been secured by her, living in supervised housing for women with similar backgrounds. Text on black screen, William never knew his mother. Considering her starting point, Judith has developed remarkably, noted her counselor's final report. She manages her finances with minimal assistance, maintains appropriate workplace behavior, and has formed healthy friendships with co-workers. While she continues to exhibit some developmental limitations, her daily functioning exceeds all initial projections. Correspondence throughout this period was maintained by Martha Hawkins, the woman who had helped Judith understand her situation years earlier. In a letter dated April 1959, Judith wrote, "Dear Martha, I have saved enough money to buy a radio. The ladies I live with are teaching me to bake pies to sell at church functions. I visited William last month. He doesn't know me, but I still bring him soft toys. The nurses say he likes music. I'm learning to accept things as they are." William Leadbetter, now 7 years old, remained in institutional care at the state hospital in Farmington, Missouri. A stark picture of profound disability is painted by his medical records. He never developed speech, could not walk independently, suffered frequent seizures despite medication, and required assistance with all aspects of daily living. William's condition was continued to be documented by Dr. Victor McCusick's research team, though their focus had shifted to using his case as a teaching example rather than expecting new medical insights. Text on black screen, some bloodlines weren't meant to continue. An extreme example of genetic collapse resulting from consanguinity is represented by the Leadbetter case, McCusick explained in a 1958 lecture to medical students at Washington University. Multiple recessive disorders that would typically appear in perhaps 1 in several million births in the general population are exhibited by the child, but became tragically probable due to the concentration of recessive genes in his family line. Thomas Leadbetter, who had been sentenced to 7 years imprisonment in 1952, was released on parole in December 1957. Parole records indicate he initially returned to Shannon County but found himself unwelcome in a community that had not forgotten the scandal. He subsequently relocated to eastern Oklahoma, where housing on their farm was provided by distant relatives. He remained socially isolated by choice and circumstance, but complied with all conditions of his release, noted his parole officer. Judith's mother and Thomas's daughter, Eleanor Leadbetter, spent her remaining years at State Hospital No. 3 in Nevada, Missouri. Her medical records indicate a diagnosis of chronic melancholia with paranoid features, treated with the limited psychiatric methods of the era. She passed away in October 1958 from complications of pneumonia, having never reconciled with her father or daughter. Text on black screen, William's suffering finally ended. Beyond the Ozarks and throughout them, medical and social practice continued to be influenced by the broader impact of the Leadbetter case. In 1960, the Rural Genetic Counseling Initiative was established by the Missouri Department of Health, sending trained professionals to county extension offices specifically to address concerns about genetic risks in historically isolated communities. An influential paper titled Cultural Isolation and Genetic Consequences in Rural American Communities was published in 1961 by Dr. Margaret Collins, whose work with Judith had shaped her understanding of rural social dynamics. She writes, "Pockets of extreme isolation that persisted well into the 20th century were created by the Ozark region's unique geography. These conditions allowed for the development of alternate family structures and marriage patterns that increased genetic risk. Understanding these historical patterns is essential for effective interventions in similar communities that may still exist." Through Dr. McCusick's continued research came the most lasting scientific legacy. His observations of William Leadbetter and subsequent genetic studies of other isolated Ozark communities contributed significantly to the mapping of recessive inherited disorders. When McCusick published the first edition of Mendelian Inheritance in Man in 1966, several conditions identified in William were included with references to a case study from rural Missouri. For William himself, life remained circumscribed by profound disability. In November 1962, at age 10, respiratory complications that his weakened system could not overcome were developed by him. Hospital records indicate he passed away on November 14, with the cause listed as pneumonia secondary to congenital disorders. Her son's passing was notified to Judith, and a simple funeral service arranged by the state hospital was attended by her. Appropriate grief was displayed by Miss Leadbetter, but she also expressed that William was at peace now, noted the attending social worker. She brought wildflowers she had collected herself and requested they be placed with him. Text on black screen, Judith found a fragile peace. In the years that followed, the life she had built was maintained by Judith. County records indicate she eventually moved into independent housing in 1965, though she continued to receive periodic supportive services. She never married or had additional children, a decision she explained in a letter to Martha Hawkins. "The doctors told me any children I might have could have problems because of my family history. I've made peace with that. Some bloodlines weren't meant to continue." Thomas Leadbetter died in 1971 at age 76, having lived his final years in obscurity. Natural causes are listed on his death certificate with no further details. No obituary appeared in local papers, and cemetery records indicate a simple burial with no attendees. By the early 1970s, the Ozark region had been dramatically transformed by the infrastructure improvements initiated in response to the Leadbetter case and similar situations. Previously isolated hollows were reached by paved roads. Rural electrification was nearly complete, and telephone service had expanded to most areas. The conditions that had allowed the Leadbetter family to exist in extreme isolation for generations no longer existed in the region. In 1974, a comprehensive study of the county's demographic changes since 1950 was commissioned by the Shannon County Historical Society. Their report concluded, the pattern of isolated family compounds maintaining separate existence from mainstream society has essentially disappeared from the county. Improved transportation infrastructure, expanded education access, and increased economic opportunities have integrated previously isolated populations. Text on black screen, her final words held a warning. From 1982 comes Judith Leadbetter's final documented appearance in public records, when at age 48 she provided testimony to researchers from the University of Missouri conducting an oral history project on rural Ozark life. Her reflection 30 years after the events that shaped her life is captured in the transcript. "I don't blame anyone anymore. Not my grandfather, not my mother, not even myself. None of us knew any different. We lived the only way we knew how. Cut off from everything. When you live that way for generations, what's wrong starts to seem right just because it's all you've ever known. The doctors explained to me about the blood being too close, about how that hurt William. I understand now why things happened the way they did. I hope others can learn from our story." If you've watched this entire documentary about one of America's most tragic genetic stories, leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end, so I can get to know who truly appreciates these historical investigations." Make sure you're subscribed to this channel for more hidden American histories. Hit the like button if you found this story enlightening and share with others who appreciate learning about these forgotten chapters of our past. These stories, though difficult, help us understand the importance of community connection and the dangers of extreme isolation. Text on black screen, from darkness came light. A powerful reminder of how geographic isolation, lack of education, and generational practices can create conditions where tragedy becomes inevitable is served by the legacy of the Leadbetter family. Fundamental changes in rural outreach, genetic counseling, and medical understanding that have benefited countless others were contributed to by their story. In this way, from the darkest circumstances came knowledge that continues to prevent similar suffering to this day.